Thank you, Michael, and thank you, esteemed architects in the room. We have some very important architects today, especially sitting in the front row. Thank you for coming. And musicians, religious, priests, and members of the arts. Really have enjoyed this mix of talks in these 2 days. I think we've tried to cover a lot, and I'm not going to try to cover a lot. You just heard the whole deal. And I'm just going to try to focus on one thing that I think is important right now. But that's why we let Dennis start things off, and I just give a little coda here. I'd like to talk about originality and tradition. And how does one extend? This is one of the things that the conference proposes to talk about. How does one extend and transform the tradition of Catholic church architecture today? Now, I accept that some of you in the room think this is an irrelevant task. And since our time is totally different than all times before, and that tradition is over, I accept that. And I don't necessarily try to convince you otherwise. But I would like to remember something said early on in his pontificate by His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, because he talked about this issue. And he says, well, it all depends on the correct interpretation of the council. The problems in its implementation arose from the fact that two contrary hermeneutics came face to face and quarreled with each other. One caused confusion. The other, silently but more and more visibly, bore and is bearing fruit. On the one hand, there is an interpretation of what I would call a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. It has frequently availed itself of the sympathies of the mass media, and also one trend of modern theology. On the other hand, there is a hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the one subject, church, which the Lord has given to us. When these two buildings close to us today were first built, they were given great opprobrium. Not because they were ugly, nor were they dysfunctional, nor were they poorly built. They were criticized for a much more heinous crime, for being traditional. Why was being traditional considered so terrible in the 1940s and 1960s? Because they show no creativity. They do not reflect their time period. They might as well be mere copies because they show no adventurousness, no minimalism or functionalism in their aesthetic. Yet these two buildings have outlived their critics, and most of the buildings built at the same time. Today, the National Gallery of Art can be considered one of the finest art galleries in the world. And the National Shrine is a great symbol of Catholicism in our nation's capital, where you go on Sunday and there's a United Nations of the Faithful gathering. Now, architects and artists naturally want to invent or innovate. I believe that's very healthy. And it makes for a very rich society. However, there's also the concern that tradition stifles originality. And I would agree, if that were true, that would be very bad. The great masterpieces of architecture down through the ages are put forward for their originality. We teach our students in the arts that the highest good is to be original. The reality is, of all the buildings, of all the churches that are built, even at our time, not all are actually going to be highly original. But our culture also recognizes brilliance and sets it up on a pedestal for its invention and innovation. Here are two buildings that were very innovative. In the 1400s, Leon Battista Alberti, we've heard a lot about him this weekend, did something very innovative in that he built a church, the first time a church, in fact, the first time a building that was occupied would be entered through a triumphal arch. And not only did he do that, but he combined it with a pediment. So it was very innovative at the time, and still considered today to be a great building. Another project to the right by Michelangelo, this is Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's, which, though was not built exactly this way, is also very, very important, because Michelangelo was the first architect to propose that a church be entered through a portico, through a temple front, through a colonnade with a pediment. This is the first time ever in history that a church would be entered this way. So two great architects, and I don't think you can really argue with Alberti, and I hope you won't argue with Michelangelo, because he was the best at all of the arts. But two great architects who were original, and we are inspired by them, and we continue to go there and be inspired by these architects and these buildings. What about the Baldacchino by Bernini? There was nothing like it in size at its time. It was a work of technical bravura. In fact, it still is a work of technical bravura. I've tried to do bronze work, and some of you in this room have tried to do bronze work. Can you imagine having Solomonic columns that are tens and entablature and angels and cross and so on, that's 10 stories tall, and build it inside of a church? Can you imagine that? It's incredible. And it's also beautiful, and it's sculpted, and it has iconography. And it has the iconography of Eden and of paradise and of all the things that Dennis just pointed out. It was considered radical for its time because Bernini combined two ideas that had been used to shelter the holy place. One is the moving canopy held on wood columns that would accompany the Eucharist as it was traveled through the streets. He combined that idea, the temporary moving tent, which probably goes back to the tent in the wilderness, and he combined that with the permanent, solid baldacchino or ciborium of the ancient churches, even from the time of Constantine, where 4 columns out of marble would create the holy place. And you can see that fusion, that invention, especially with these columns that are Solomonic, that are wavy, they don't really look that structural. They're made out of bronze. And then look at this canopy. Look at this canopy. This light, moving, blowing in the wind element, and yet it's all out of bronze. So he fuses these two things, and it's a technical bravura, but it's also an architectural, iconographic bravura. And at the time it was considered very radical and was criticized until it was built and they saw it. And it was hard to criticize it after it was done. It is original on all different levels. And at the same time, it was inspired by the spiral columns, much smaller, given by the emperor to St. Peter's, which of course, that's why we call them Solomonic, were thought to be from the Temple of Solomon. And the consciousness of the church to connect back to that original temple of Judaism, of monotheism. And this baldacchino, of course, has become a classic and has inspired many great baldacchinos, especially I think of in France, but we have them in this country, and they're each unique, and there's even some humble, wimpy attempts at it. So I'm all for originality. I'm all for innovation, and I just bring up a few examples of that. There are tons to talk about in originality, but it can also be overrated. And since true originality on the order of Michelangelo or Bernini is actually very hard to find, who is the Bernini of today or the Michelangelo of today? We instead turn to novelty because each of us as architects is taught we have to be original just like Bernini and Michelangelo and Le Corbusier, and we all have to be the same way, and Frank Lloyd Wright. So what do? we turn to novelty. Novelty is much easier to do than to do something truly original. The cult of novelty means that anything goes, and it makes architects think that our role is to provide change for change's sake. One of the reasons we buy the idea of novelty is because we believe the syllogism that change in architecture is by definition the same as scientific innovation, which I think we should question. What is the architectural equivalent of the iPhone? Anything in architecture that is that successful and is adopted by a majority of architects would be considered by our profession as no longer innovative, as no longer original. Only the first one is original. You copy it, you make a couple of them, it's no longer original. As King Solomon wrote, there's nothing new under the sun. The reality is that modernism, while often invoking originality, was also greatly indebted to historical precedent, both architectural and machine. Of course, the protagonists of the modern movement, such as Le Corbusier, Gropius, Wright, Aalto, and Mies, were quite cognizant of history. They learned it very well in their day, and they claimed to be the fulfillment of it. But theirs was not so much a belief in history, but a belief in historicism, in which change always signifies progress. One of the ways modernism defines itself is as being different from the past, differentiating itself from things which have come before. Symmetry is replaced by asymmetry. Harmony is replaced by dissonance. Masonry is replaced by steel and concrete. Human scale by the machine-made. Hand craftsmanship with the industrial. And beauty with provocativeness. When I was in architecture school 25, 30 years ago, the word was never used. The B word was never used. It's coming back, which is good. If you read the leaders or the promoters of the modern movement, it becomes clear that they view modern man and the modern age as distinct from everything which came before. It is also of note that similarly to the Protestant Reformation, modernism defines itself as against images, ornament, history, tradition, and architectural language. It's the architecture of rupture, of discontinuity with the past. But is discontinuity an appropriate goal for the eternal church? It seems problematic for a representation of a church which teaches the relevance of goodness, truth, and beauty. If we study the history of sacred architecture through the lens of originality, there is certainly much richness, as has already been pointed out. Yet, I would argue we can study these same masterpieces through the lens of continuity and find that, yes, they're original, they're masterpieces, but they also have principles which are timeless and relevant today, and that they share with other great and not so great buildings. For instance, down through the ages, we can see a great continuity in the design of parts of a church. I offer you the idea of the sanctuary. In both of these disparate examples, a late Romanesque basilica in Rome, San Clemente, and a 20th century medievalizing church in Florida, in the U.S.,